Ever since the introduction of the Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicle to the war in Ukraine, a lot of debate has sparked on the internet about its effectiveness, especially when compared to the Soviet and Russian BMPs. In this video, we will be taking a look at the Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicle model that has been delivered to Ukraine, the M2A2 ODS-SA, and we will be comparing it to the BMP-2 and the BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles that the Russians have been mainly using so far. Why am I not comparing BMP-1, or why am I not talking about more modern Bradleys? Well, BMP-1 is kind of old and not really comparable to Bradley in this case, and more modern Bradleys will not really be a topic for this video because they are currently not being used, but I will talk about them in a bit later in the video. Now, I want to stress out that this will mainly be a comparison on a technical level. I will not be analyzing every single piece of the combat footage where these vehicles are involved, that would be just too much, but rather I want to focus on the technical aspects of these vehicles so we can get a better picture of their capabilities. Also, I will often refer to M2A2 DSSA as either just M2A2 or Bradley, but unless I specify anything different, I want you to take into account that I'm talking about M2A2 ODSSA in those cases. When comparing anything from Russia and Ukraine, it is hard to find the latest and unbiased information. That is why I'm proud to be, once again, sponsored by Ground News. Ground News aims to shine a light on media bias and hold media accountable in a landscape where it's impossible to consult a single news source for the full picture. Ground News combines stories and articles from thousands of outlets, local and national, in one place so readers can see the full picture of what's being reported around the world. You can compare headlines from articles reporting on the same story to see the differences in language and how that can shape public opinion. Let's take the story about the US sending the depleted uranium ammunition to Ukraine as an example. You can check how each side of the political spectrum words the story, but you also get an overview of the bias distribution, ownership, factuality, and the country of origin of the sources reporting on the story. Ground News lets you develop a well-rounded worldview by letting you see every side of every story with access to international perspectives. You can follow your favorite interests to get breaking news on a specific person, location, source, or topic, such as Ukraine war, or you can create your own feed. If you'd like to experience it firsthand and make sure you are seeing all sides of the story, you can subscribe for as little as $5 per month at ground.news/redeffect or by following the link in the description below. Now, without further ado, let's start with the firepower. M2A2 is armed with a 25mm M242 autocannon or chain gun, as well as dual TOW launcher on the side of the turret. The 25mm autocannon is an open-bolt system and can fire either APDS to deal with lightly armored vehicles or high explosive to deal with infantry and other soft targets. Of course, there is also the M240 coaxial machine gun, which can be utilized for the same purpose. The TOW missiles are there, of course, to deal with heavily armored targets, aka tanks. Before we go to BMP-2, keep in mind that I will also be comparing the fire control systems of these vehicles as well. BMP-2 is armed with a 2A42 30mm autocannon, which is also open-bolt dual-fat like the one of Bradley. Now, it can fire either AP or APDS in its stead, and high-explosive shells. There is also the coaxial PK machine gun and the ATGM launcher on the top of the turret. Most of the time it is a Conqueror's ATGM. Unlike the TOW launcher on the Bradley, the BMP-2 launcher is completely unarmored and can only house one missile. Both ATGM systems need to be loaded manually, but it is a bit better done on the BMP-2 because the crew in the turret can do it without much trouble, while the TOW launcher on the Bradley can only be reloaded from a safe position by the man in the back, through the hatch on the roof, not by the gunner or commander. There is also the BMP-2M, which is armed with two dual Cornet launchers on each side of the turret. This is obviously much deadlier than the Conqueror's missile, and these launchers do have armored covers on them, but cannot be loaded from the inside by the crew in the same way that the Conqueror's launchers can. Now, the BMP-3 is armed with a 30mm 2A72 autocannon, as well as a 100mm low-velocity 2A70 cannon, which also doubles as an ATGM launcher. The 2A72 autocannon is also dual-fed and can fire AP or APDS and HE shells. Now, the big upside of BMP-3 over the both BMP-2 and the Bradley is the 100mm cannon. This kind of armament gives BMP-3 the ability to fire a powerful 100mm HE shell at the enemy structures as well as soft targets, greatly increasing its firepower. Another upside of this system is that it removes the requirement for the ATGM launchers on the vehicle, since the cannon now serves that purpose. Because of that, it also removes the risk of the crew getting injured by reloading the launchers. BMP-3's cannon is loaded with an autoloader when firing the high explosive fragmentation shells, but loaded semi-automatically by the help of the rammer when loading ATGMs, because the missiles are being held in a separate rack. Nevertheless, it is definitely an upside when it comes to how the missiles are reloaded. There is also the coaxial PK machine gun, but BMP-3 also has two bow machine guns which are operated by the dismounts while they are in the vehicle. Now, what about the fire control system? From what I could find, the M2A2 ODS-SA has a second generation thermal imaging system for the gunner, compared to the first generation previously used on the regular ODS and previous Bradley variants. It also incorporates a thermal camera for the driver. On top of other things, it also has a global positioning system. This is all pretty advanced, and you will see why when we get to the BMPs. But one problem of the Bradley's fire control system is the lack of the independent commander's sight, be it with the thermal or not. The commander has no sight of his own. He can only see what the gunner is seeing through an extension, but only has 8 periscopes for all-around view. Granted, he can take control of the turret and override it, but all of that is kind of in vain because there is literally no way for him to spot for targets when buttoned down other than the periscopes. Of course, this is fixed in the A3 variants of the Bradley, but they are not a topic of today's video. BMP-2, unlike Bradley, has no thermal imaging system for either gunner or commander, but mostly relies on the old night vision system for night observation and basic optics for day observation. Of course, there is a BMP-2M, which does utilize the second generation thermal imaging system for the gunner and has a completely stabilized independent sight for the commander, albeit without a thermal imager. But it needs to be pointed out that these are rare, even though we have seen them being used in Ukraine. Their numbers pale in comparison to the numbers of basic BMP-2 models. Now, the commander of regular BMP-2 does also have his own sight for target observation, which he can also use to override the turret to the target. Only problem is that it is not stabilized, just like it is not stabilized in either T-72 tanks or in the T-80B tanks. It relies on the free flotation for observation on the move, but you don't need me to tell you that that method is not desirable. But even though it is not stabilized, it is still a plus over what Bradley has, or rather doesn't have. The problem for BMP is that every Bradley out there has a thermal sight, so I would still bet my money on the Bradley because having a thermal drastically increases the chances of spotting any targets. Now, BMP-3 is a bit weird. We pretty much have both BMP-3 with and BMP-3 without thermals being produced simultaneously. I've searched for quite some time trying to find numbers of how many of them are produced with the thermal sights and how many with the older sights, but I couldn't find anything. We have images of new BMP-3s being delivered since the start of the invasion with thermals, and we have them being delivered without thermals. We see quite a bit of both being used by Russians in Ukraine. It is safe to say that BMP-3s with thermals are definitely far more common than the BMP-2M, but how common are they actually, I really can't tell you. The way the BMP-3 with second generation thermal sight can be recognized is by the main gun sight with two windows. The BMP-3, which lacks a thermal sight, has a single window for the main gun sight. It can also be recognized by the lack of a small IR laser beamer on the right side of the turret. And to be honest, there's quite a bit of them if you look at the pictures of BMP-3s in Ukraine. Certainly more than what I was expecting. BMP-3 also has an unstabilized commander's sight, and there is no modification with a stabilized one out there. Stabilized or not though, having one is definitely an advantage. When we take both firepower and fire control system into account, Bradley certainly has an advantage over the BMP-2, there is no doubt about it, but BMP-3 definitely has an advantage when it comes to the firepower. And if we compare the ones with thermal to the Bradley, then both firepower and fire control system are better. Firepower because of the 100mm gun, and the fire control system because of the second generation thermal sight, coupled with an independent sight for the commander. It should be noted though that BMP-3 lacks most of the modern systems found in the Bradley, like the proper GPS, connectivity, etc. So when it comes to electronics, Bradley is superior, but when it comes to the raw fighting capability, there is no doubt that BMP-3 is superior. But unfortunately for BMP-3, this is possibly the only advantage it has over Bradley. You will see now when we get to the protection. Bradley was originally designed with all-around 14.5mm protection. This was required because of the increasing number of BTRs which were equipped with 14.5mm KPV machine guns. But M2A2 saw an increase in protection with added steel plate armor to the aluminum construction of the Bradley. The new armor is able to stop 30mm solid AP shells fired from a BMP. I've seen sources claim it is meant to stop 30mm APDS, but that is not true. The APDS protection is achieved by mounting the reactive armor tiles, base armor does not protect against the sabots. This armor was obviously made because of the Soviet BMP-2s becoming more and more numerous, so being able to protect against their autocannon fire is a big plus. But it is not clear in what amount the Russians are actually utilizing the APDS when compared to the regular AP shells for their 30mm autocannons. We simply have no data on that. The up-armored design allows for the installation of the reactive armor tiles, also known as BRAT, which stands for Bradley Reactive Armor Tiles. This armor is supposed to give Bradley protection against most common RPG threats, but it is not going to protect it against tandem-shaped heat. Even so, it is a great add-on for the Bradley, since most infantry fighting vehicles, including the BMPs, lack any protection against RPGs and can easily get penetrated by them. Of course, this armor package is not installed on all Bradleys currently in Ukraine, but it should be mentioned nevertheless. Now, the protection of BMP-2 is not good. The front is rated to stop 23mm AP, which is barely better than the 14.5mm, and the sides are only rated against regular machine guns. Anything bigger will go through, so something like a 50 BMG or a Soviet 12.7x108 is going to rip through the side armor if shot at it directly. BMP-3 is not much better, although it also offers 30mm AP protection on the front, like the Bradley, which is definitely a plus, especially when fighting the enemy that has vehicles armed with such weapons. Its side protection is basically the same like the BMP-2, that is, only rated to stop regular machine gun fire. This is a big problem because both BMP-2 and BMP-3 are much more vulnerable to artillery fire than the Bradley, and by that I mean artillery fragments. Neither of those can actually take a direct hit from the artillery. There are several pictures of BMPs penetrated by artillery fragments on the side. BMP-3 is made out of ABT-102 aluminum alloy, being slightly better than ABT-101. Now, the data for ABT-101 states that the required thickness to stop 152mm artillery fragments from 3 to 4 meters is around 53mm. The side of BMP-3 is 43mm of ABT-102. According to some data, 102 is slightly better than 101, so let's say it would be like 50 or 51mm requirement. The side armor is not enough to stop that. In fact, it can only stop 152mm fragments if the shell detonated at around 15 meters or more from the vehicle. That is horrible. And based on this data, the 15 to 16mm thick sides of BMP-2, which has a steel construction, have very similar performance against artillery fragments. Bradley does not have such issues, because the aluminum construction, coupled with add-on steel plates, offers more than good enough protection against artillery fragments. It should be noted though that there are add-on armors for both BMP-2 and BMP-3, and we have seen both being used in Ukraine, although not to a big extent. These add-on armors offer all-around protection to the BMPs against 12.7mm AP projectiles, as well as, of course, the very needed protection against artillery fragments. They also include slat armor to increase the protection against RPG threats, but again, these are not common at all. Last year, the manufacturer of BMPs had stated that their protection needs to be increased, based on the lessons learned from the war, but so far there is no serial change to the vehicles that would suggest them actually doing anything about it. These add-on armors were a thing before 2022 and have only been delivered in low numbers. Now, it should also be mentioned that BMPs have an advantage of being a pretty small target when compared to the Bradley. Not really as important as anything else, but it should be mentioned. Now, when it comes to the mine protection, it should be noted that BMP-2 has no apparent mine protection implemented to it. On the other hand, Bradley and BMP-3 do. Bradley has a 9mm thick plate on the front third of the hull's belly, which is made to increase the chances of survival of the vehicle because it's expected that it would roll over the mine while going forward. The seats, from what I could find, are made to have some mine resistance by being suspended from the sides of the hull. For the mine protection, BMP-3 also has a hull belly add-on, although it is spaced 10mm aluminum plate held by a waffle construction. It is also mounted on the front of the hull like the Bradley, and is meant to protect the vehicle if it drives over the mine frontally. The seats are also suspended from the walls of the hull for the dismount and the crew in the turret. The driver's seat is attached to the floor, but it has shock absorbers, and combined with the front belly armor, it should provide quite good mine protection to the driver. In comparison on previous BMPs, including BMP-2, it was most often the driver that suffered death or injury from mines, so BMP-3 is a big improvement there. There are also some things that should be mentioned. On BMP-2, we often see infantry preferring to drive sitting on top of the vehicle, rather than inside. This is mostly because of the poor protection that the BMP offers, and if the vehicle hits a mine or they come under fire, they can quickly get off the vehicle and get away. For BMP-3 and Bradley, that is not really the case because their hulls are rather tall. But the way BMP-3 is designed, it would allow infantry to ride on the rear platform that goes over the engine deck. This is because unlike Bradley and BMP-2, it doesn't feature a regular rear exit. That is because BMP-3 has an engine in the back, which is pretty unusual for an infantry fighting vehicle. Because of that, the dismounts are situated very close to the fighting compartment of the vehicle and have a lot more space than in both Bradley and BMP-2, but have to exit through a very unconventional way over the engine. They do have protection from small arms fire, provided by the big doors that open on the roof. This also allows them to drive standing on this platform while the doors are open, if they want to quickly exit or be able to shoot back at the enemies. The doors also have small hatches on them which can also be used for the same purpose, but BMP-2 and Bradley also have such hatches. Overall, when it comes to the protection, Bradley beats both of them, especially if we consider the artillery fragments as a very big threat in this war. While the add-on armors do come close to the Bradley's level of protection, they are not very common. I also want to mention the 4S24 ERA armor package for BMP-3 that Russians keep refusing to put into production. This ERA can stop tandem-shaped rockets, like the one of RPG-29, pretty much dead on without any structural damage to the vehicle, and still allow the amphibious capability of the BMP-3. But because Russia, this package has never been adopted for actual service. When it comes to the mobility, Bradley's stronger armor protection is definitely having an impact. M2A2 ODSSA weighs 34 tons and is powered by a 600 horsepower VTA 903T diesel engine, which gives it a power-to-weight ratio of around 17.5 horsepower per ton. The maximum torque of the engine is 1643 Nm, and the maximum speed of the M2A2 ODS is stated to be 38 miles per hour, which would be 61 km per hour, and the reverse speed from what I could find is 11 to 12 km per hour. The mobility of BMP-2, despite its poor protection, isn't really good either. It is powered by a 300 horsepower UDT-20 diesel engine, and the vehicle weighs 14 tons, giving it a power-to-weight ratio of around 21 horsepower per ton. The engine also produces a torque of around 1030 Nm, and the maximum speed of the vehicle is 65 km per hour. The reverse speed is stated to be at around 10 km per hour. The mobility might sound a bit better than the one of Bradley, but if you consider the big difference in their protection characteristics, it is a little underwhelming. The vehicle weighs more than 2 times less. Of course, the lightweight is an upside in certain situations, but still. BMP-3 is a completely different story though. It is powered by a UDT-29M 500 horsepower diesel engine and weighs only 18.7 tons, which gives it a power-to-weight ratio of 26.7 horsepower per ton. The engine produces maximum torque of 1461 Nm, and the maximum speed of the vehicle is stated to be 72 km per hour with 20 km per hour in reverse. BMP-3 also has the adjustable suspension, which allows the vehicle to be either lowered or lifted, allowing the ground clearance to be changed between 190 and 510 mm. When it comes to the mobility, BMP-3 is a clear winner, which kind of begs the question, why didn't they make better armor for it? Would a couple of extra tons have made such a difference when you have such a powerful engine for a vehicle of this weight? They could have easily allowed for the 50 cal protection on the sides and would still have a pretty mobile platform. What confuses me the most here is that they knew that the side protection needs to be better. BMP-2s in Afghanistan suffered a lot from ambushes by 12.7mm machine guns, so much that they had to develop a BMP-2D upgrade which added extra protection to the sides, and yet BMP-3 was not made with such protection in mind. At the end, BMP-2 is definitely the worst one. It has inferior firepower, fire control system and protection to both Bradley and BMP-3. Mobility is slightly better than the Bradleys, but it is completely nullified by its poor protection. Bradley definitely takes the crown for the most protected vehicle and has the best fire control system, considering the fact that not every BMP-3 will be equipped with the thermals, plus all the modern electronics that are also absent on the BMPs. BMP-3 would take the win for the firepower because of its 100mm gun, as well as the mobility. But I can't emphasize enough how poor the protection of BMP-2 and 3 is for modern standards. Having an armored vehicle be penetrated by an artillery fragment of a shell that exploded 10 meters away from the vehicle is very concerning. As I said before, Russians are definitely aware that this is a problem, it's just that we are not yet seeing any changes being done en masse. The numbers of up-armored BMP-3s have been increasing since the start of the war, but they are still very rare when compared to the rest of them. That would be all. If you like my content, you can support me on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a nice day.